Hey, Motorman here, and today we're going to talk about riding in the rain. I get so many questions about that. And also, before I go any further, I want to mention that my wife Donna, you won't see her for probably a couple of months. She's getting a total hip replacement January 31st. Until then, she's in quite a bit of pain, but you got to wait for the surgery. So let's talk about this. As you can see, we've got puddles all over the place. The riders aren't really having any kind of a problem. The real problem when riding in the rain is when you just don't use common sense. You can't ride in the rain just like you do when it's dry out. In other words, you got to give yourself a little bit more time to stop. Don't follow so closely, and don't ride at your motorcycle's limits or your skills limits. Now, on wet roads, once it first starts to rain, you're going to get a lot of oil washed up onto the surface of the road. That's when it's most dangerous. But after it rains for a while and the oil drains off, as you can see here, this is, by the way, from last week's class. That's Greg Moto Jitsu, and he's pushing the bike pretty far, but he's not at the lean limits. If he was at the lean limits, it would be scraping the floorboards and he could lose some traction. It's also important in wet pavement or in the rain to be smooth with the clutch and throttle, especially when taking off from a stop. Be very smooth letting that clutch out. You want to prevent that rear wheel from breaking loose. If it breaks loose, it could spin, you could go down. And while moving along, again, be smooth, easy with that throttle. Greg's very good with the throttle. He's pushing the bike almost to its limits. With a Harley like this, you can probably use about 90% of its lean limits in the rain. Now, with a bike like this, an adventure tourer, you've probably got about a 45-degree lean angle in the drive pavement before you start to lose traction when leaning the motorcycle. But I wouldn't push it anywhere near 45%, even though in the rain, once the oil is washed off the road, you do have 90% of the traction you have in the dry. I still wouldn't push it that far. I call that common sense. Lean about half as much as you would normally lean in dry conditions in the rain, and you should be all right. Now, there's a fairly new rider. He's not familiar with leaning the bike to its limits even in dry pavement. So, of course, if you're in that shape where you're just starting to get over your fear of leaning the motorcycle, you want to push that bike as little as possible in the rain. And again, it's very important to be smooth with the clutch and throttle. Even if you're cruising along at 40 or 50 miles an hour, you don't want to give it wide open throttle when the pavement is wet because, if you lose traction, it's a problem. Now, this rider's got a real good handle on the techniques, good clutch and throttle control, good rear brake control, turns his head and eyes, and he's using proper caution here. He's not pushing that bike to its limits. It's the last thing you want to do in the rain, especially out on the street. This parking lot, by the way, has got a sealer on it, and that tends to make it a little slicker than what you would actually find on the general pavement out on the road anywhere, but he's not having a problem. Here's an overhead drone shot. The rider pulling in now has very skinny tires on that KTM, and they appear to be very aggressive knobbies. He's not pushing that limit at all, which might be a good thing. I know that knobbies are good in dirt and mud, etc., and probably even in the wet, but in wet, muddy roads maybe, but definitely not on pavement, especially slippery pavement like this. But he's using the proper caution, not leaning too far. He could go a little bit further. He could be a little bit more aggressive, but not much. Here's another adventure tourer, but this bike appeared to have normal street tires on it. They definitely weren't off-road, and he could push the bike a little bit further. I always say it's be cautious rather than aggressive, especially in the rain. And he does a good job turning his head and eyes. Those bikes also have kind of a sensitive throttle, so you got to be careful with that. Too much throttle input too fast, the rear wheel breaks loose, bike slides out from under you, so you got to be cognizant of that fact. Same thing with this bike. I think he's being a little more aggressive with his lean than the last rider, and he's not using all the space available, so that means he's having to turn a little bit tighter, but not a big deal because he's being cautious with his speed. He's obviously using a good throttle because he's not breaking that rear tire loose. If you were to break it loose, sometimes you can catch it, sometimes you can't, and the bike slides out from under you. This is a Pan America. This rider does pretty well most of the time. These are students in the class, and this happened to be this past Sunday a very good class. As far as we didn't have that one guy, that one guy that has the serious problem. Never had that in this class. Everyone here practically has, I'm sure, practiced prior to getting to the class and has a good idea of what the techniques are and how to use them. And it showed because they were able to get through the class rather easily. Now, this rider's on a Ducati Scrambler. This is an extremely nimble bike, but he's a fairly new rider. I'm not sure if he had practiced or not, but he does have some problems turning his head and eyes. And with that short wheelbase, literally he could probably turn that bike about a 12-foot turning radius, I would imagine. But he's not at the stage where he could really take advantage of his motorcycle's limits. For more information on the proper techniques I teach, the proper use of your head and eyes, the friction zone, a little pressure on the rear brake, get yourself a copy of the Ride Like a Pro Experience video. You can get that at ridelikeapro.com. It is a life changer. It will be the best $20 you ever spent on your motorcycle.